Okay, ready to go? Hello and welcome to our second HARPS webinar focusing on the version 2 standard. My name's Belinda Millard and I'm part of the management team at One Direction ANZ, the managing entity for HARPS. We're going to start today's webinar with an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, One Direction ANZ acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. I'll now hand over to my colleague Tristan to commence today's presentation.
Great, thanks, Belle. So maybe on to the next slide. Yeah, look, welcome to, this is the second webinar we've done talking about specifically version 2 of the HARPS standard. There's Belinda and myself who are the One Direction team, but I'd also like to introduce Brice from Woolworths, Leah from Metcash, and Dion from the IFPA, and they'll be introducing themselves in a little bit more detail as we'll be doing a little bit of talking through this presentation. So, Belle, maybe on to the next slide.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just run through the agenda for today. And just bearing in mind that the primary focus of today's session was really to remind businesses, particularly Tier 1, that the go live date for version 2 or the mandatory transition timeline is coming up quite soon. So we've focused a lot more on transition and obviously information to support that change. So we will start off with background and ways of working, and I know that we've got some new businesses to HARPS registering to this webinar today. So I thought it was important that we go over what HARPS is about and who's involved with HARPS, who are our stakeholders. And then we'll talk about those transition timelines, a reminder of where our document library is located and where you can get all of the resources that can help you with your transition to version 2. Then we'll go through some FAQs in relation to the standard itself and the scheme rules. So we'll go through all of those questions that come through our helpline and our inquiries forms and provide you some information on those. We're next going to talk about communication between tiers 1 and 2, which is really important for some specific parts of our standard and our scheme rules. And then we'll just give you a reminder of who the HARPS training providers are. Finally, we'll talk about a new project that we're working on, which is a post-audit survey. So we'll be coming out to suppliers, asking you about your thoughts and experiences of the HARPS audit and really gathering that intel to ensure that we are trying to improve the audit process. Now, we'd just like to let everyone know that there is an email address that you can send any questions that you have through to. So if you want to take a quick photo or jot this email address down now, we've actually got one of our team members, Lacey, online at cbsupport@harpsonline.com.au, and Lacey can help you out with any questions that you might have that we could raise at the end of this webinar. Okay, I'll hand over to you, Tristan.
Thanks, Belle. So just a quick reminder, just to get the foundation right around, what is HARPS. So HARPS has been designed to assist with food safety, legal and trade requirements. So food safety probably makes up about 80% of the elements, and then it's trade and legal requirements that makes up the remaining 20%. It's only for supply to the major grocery retailers in Australia, and it aims to eliminate multiple audits. So one audit satisfies all retailers. If you just flick on, Belle. And really, all the elements within HARPS have come about from essentially the pain points that retailers have experienced that's come through to them in the form of customer complaints, rejections at DCs, withdrawals, and recalls. And it essentially means that all retailers accept a single standard. Belinda and myself, in the form of One Direction, we are not the decision makers, we're purely the facilitators. So we do help work with suppliers to make sure they have a voice with the retailers. And the advantage being that we have all the retailers sitting around one table, so it's much easier for industry to then be able to present their views, and we package that up on behalf of the industry to present to the retailers for discussion and decision making. And on the next slide, we can see that one of the points around, what's the need for version 2? Version 1 launched in October 2016, and I think the original intention is we would have a version 2 out within sort of a couple of years. Clearly much longer. Version 1 was always an incomplete standard. You may have some BCs in there around the use of untreated manures, for example. So version 2 was really to come back and fill in those gaps in much more detail and being much more thorough. Also, the learning of all white, there was some ambiguity and duplication in some of those clauses, so that's something that's been removed, and certainly in the refinement of version 2, further ambiguity and duplication has been taken out as well. But when you look at audit was over the years, there's still ongoing compliance issues. Version 2 also addresses those that continue to lead to complaints, rejections, withdrawals, and recalls. Something we have seen is the difference from version 1 to version 2 is much more need for support and guidance, particularly for version 2, for tier 2 growers who are generally smaller. They're doing many more activities. They don't have a dedicated QA person sometimes. So we've put a lot more effort into getting guidance in more detail, plus putting out some other tools that you'll see today that will hopefully support the transition process. And over the last 6 years, the GFSI standards have also evolved a lot as well. So there's new learnings that have come across from overseas as well as within Australia. So we can make sure we've got that best practice in place, which is one way of helping protect the industry. On the next slide, you'll see this really just describes the HARPS operating model. So we have a technical advisory group that is essentially made up of anyone who isn't a retailer, as long as they have a level of technical experience. So that's the peak industry bodies, it's tier 1 and tier 2 growers. And while we're here, I'll put a call out to, if there's any more tier 2 growers that would like to get involved on the technical advisory group, please do contact us. Scheme owners, so we're represented by Fresh Care, certification bodies, auditors, QA consultants, and other technical experts. So if we do have certain elements that, for example, we need a microbiologist involved in, we will bring a specific person in to help address those parts. Just flicking on, Belle, you see that the technical advisory group essentially flows information through to the HARPS retailer committee, and it goes via us as One Direction. Increasingly, we're looking to bring the what we call the HTAG technical advisory group and the retailer committee closer together. So, moving forwards, we're actually having combined groups looking at revising and reviewing certain elements within the standard. And in that HARPS retailer committee, it's made up of all the retailers, as well as Hort Innovation, as well as a representative from the IFPA, who's Dion, who you'll be hearing from shortly, and also a Hort Council representative as well. And all this committee, facilitated by One Direction, then goes into producing the HARPS standard, which also then includes the scheme rules, the guidance, the training, the website database, etc., and all the other collateral that's there. One Direction is essentially reports through to Hort Innovation. So Hort Innovation provide that governance around ensuring we're meeting our KPIs, that we provide 6 monthly financial reports and financial audited financial statements produced by our accountant. So they have visibility of all the financials that run through One Direction, and the retailers have that visibility as well. And ultimately, that's the group that pulls together the HARPS standard and what you see today. So following on from that, I would like to introduce you to Dion. Dion, as I said, is a member of the technical advisory group. But Dion, if I could hand over to you, maybe if you could just start by giving a little bit of an overview of your background and perhaps touch upon your involvement with the HTAG as well, please.
Sure. Thanks very much, Tristan, and welcome everybody to this webinar. It's a pleasure to be involved, and certainly I enjoy my working with the One Direction team and with the HARPS initiative in general. Just a little bit of background to this first slide. The International Fresh Produce Association we were originally called PMA, Australia New Zealand, but in January last year, January 2022, United Fresh and PMA in the United States joined together and created the International Fresh Produce Association. So we've been going about 15 months now, but we're still trying to get our name out there. A change of name and a change of logo does create challenges. Everyone remembers PMA, but not necessarily the International Fresh Produce Association, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but we do essentially all of the same things. We look after food safety, we look after marketing, we look after talent in the industry, we look after innovation and technology. And one of the big things that we're pushing at the moment is sustainability. If we could just click to the next slide, that just gives an overview of IFPA in general. We've got three main tenets that we try to prosecute. That is to advocate, to connect, and to guide across the entire fresh produce and floral chains. And if we go to the next slide, my background is that I've worked in food safety for too many years, longer than I care to admit to. But in IFPA, my role is to support, as head of food safety, is to support initiatives designed to improve the safety of fresh produce across the Australian, New Zealand food supply chains. So I do that by providing guidance and advice. I run regular webinars, provide technical notes and strategies to manage food safety, and provide expertise in food standards and regulations. And that's a strong part of what I bring to the program, because I have a long background in food regulation, the development of food standards, the implementation and oversight of food standards. So that's where I come in, and it's across not only just fresh produce, but I've worked across seafood, dairy, the meat industry, etc. So if you click once again, I'm a member on the HTAG, the Technical Advisory Group, where I provide guidance and assistance. My background, if we go way back, is I'm a food microbiologist, so I'm across microbiological food safety, but also chemical food safety, which is equally important, but not such a big issue for us in this fresh produce sector. So I provide guidance to the HTAG. You know, we have challenges with things like, what about irrigation water? What should the status of irrigation water be with things like leafy vegetables, or those highly perishable, ready to eat, or fresh produce that won't undergo any further processing, such as cooking? How do we manage potential contamination from irrigation water? How do we look after things like the use of manures, animal manures, or green waste? What are the exclusion periods between the application of manure to soil and when we can harvest a crop? Recognizing that, you know, there may be the introduction of pathogens from that manure into the soil, into the production environment, that could contaminate a product. Things like hand washing, the challenges of how do we ensure that people can wash their hands effectively in the field, and what are the strategies we do if we don't have access to town water with less than 1 E. coli per 100 mil. So, you know, thinking about things like washing with what we might call non-potable water, and then the use of a hand sanitizer. Is that an appropriate way to manage the potential risks associated with contamination on people's hands, and how we ensure that, you know, the produce they're handling is handled in a hygienic manner? So that's the input I have into the HTAG. We click once more. I'm also involved in the retail committee, only as an observer, but again, to allay those concerns, or to explain or to clarify something that we've identified in terms of modifying the standard through the HTAG process. So it's about giving that reassurance to the retailers, and doing that in an independent, science-based, risk-based approach. So everything I do is about evidence and the science. And of course, the science is continuing to evolve, and we do have challenges. We see a lot of literature that has conflicting results. I was looking at something this morning about the potential for listeria contamination of mushrooms, and there's literature that says yes, it's a potential problem, and other literature that says it's not. So my role is to take that information, mine that information, and try and find an interpretation which is logical, which is science-based, which is risk-based, which is not too onerous. It's justified on the basis that it's plausible and can be done. We're not in any way trying to impose processes and practices particularly on our growers, which are not based on science, and which are not based on that overwhelming desire to ensure food safety. So Tristan, that's about where I'd stop, and I think I hand over to Brees now.
Thanks, Dion. Yes, yeah, if we could flick onto the next slide, and Brice, we'll maybe hand over to you, and if you could just sort of start by introducing yourself, that would be great.
Yes, thank you. So good day, everyone. So I'm Brice Lamargue. I'm the technical manager for fruit and vegetables, but also other categories such as fresh protein and some grocery items in Woolworths. Look, I've been involved with Tristan and Belinda for some time with the retail committee since I think 2015. And it's been a great journey. And so today I would like to go back a little bit on this and tell you a bit of a story. And the story goes like that. So once upon a time, Australian fresh produce suppliers faced a frustrating challenge. So they had to undergo different food safety audits for every retailer. And that created a great deal of complexity and duplication, making it both inefficient and costly. And that is until we all got together and decided to create a unified standard. So, as you know, in 2013, HARPS was born and we launched in 2016. But now, fast forward to the present day, and HARPS is back with an improved version that reduces even more complexities and duplications. And this standard is not only good for customers, but also for the industry as a whole. Because by having a unified standard, we can promote best practices and build trust with customer and still improve efficiencies and mitigate risk. And thanks to the collaborative efforts of industry stakeholders, such as Dion and the hashtags and people involved in the industry, we can now ensure that the suppliers have the best possible framework to provide safe, high-quality produce. But as Easter approaches, higher trading volumes are expected, as you know, and the risk of human error increases because of there can be disruptions coming with higher volume, like unexpected orders, or we need a new team, or you need a new team member to come in, or there's increased promotional activities, and all these things can contribute to the risk. And this is where HARPS can bring value, because it provides that framework to help mitigate these risks. So look, I'll just conclude the story of HARPS to say that I think it is and it will be a testament to the power of industry collaboration. And by continuing to work together and embracing standards like HARPS, we can really ensure that our industry continues to thrive, providing safe and quality fruit and vegetables for our customers. So thanks. That's all done from me.
Great. Thank you so much, Brice. And yes, it is a story. I think one of us certainly needs to write a book about this journey one day. It's been going for a while now. Thanks so much. So I'd just like to, I guess, pause and focus now on one of the key reasons for holding this webinar today. And as I mentioned earlier on, we are actually approaching the first mandatory transition timeline, and this applies to Tier 1 suppliers. So the cutoff date for Tier 1 businesses, which includes businesses that are defined as Tier 1, businesses that are defined as both Tier 1 and Tier 2, and any new businesses to HARPS. This is your mandatory transition date. So the 17th of April, 2023 for Tier 1 suppliers, not Tier 2 suppliers. That will be later this year. So what does that mean? It does mean that at your next audit, post that date, you will be required to have a version 2 audit. What it doesn't mean is that I need to have an audit to version 2 before 17th of April, 2023. You just need to ensure that you continue with your normal audit cycle, whatever that is. For example, if your audit is in November every year or thereabouts, you continue on that same pathway. But your next audit will need to be to version 2 if you are a Tier 1 supplier. For businesses that are Tier 2, your mandatory transition timeline doesn't come up until the 16th of October 2023, which was basically a year from when we actually launched the version 2 standard. And we will hold a webinar similar to this closer to that date as well. and encourage businesses that have been through the process or are starting to go through the process of transition to just feed any questions that you have through to us, because your question could be helping many other growers and businesses in the industry as well. So key dates there, 17th of April 2023, we're hitting that timeline for mandatory transition for Tier 1. Tier 2 is not until the 16th of October 2023. So just by way of reminder, if you are new to HARPS, we will ask you to automatically transition straight to version 2, regardless of what tier you are. And for those businesses that operate as both Tier 1 and Tier 2, we roll up to Tier 1 status. So in part of this discussion, when you're scheduling your HARPS audit, the CBs are typically asking the question now of your business if you would like to undergo a version 1 audit or a version 2 audit. That will continue for Tier 2 suppliers, but for Tier 1 suppliers, as of that date, 17th of April, they'll no longer be asking the question. So you'll just be expected to go straight through to version 2. I just wanted to take an opportunity to remind those that probably watched our last webinar, but particularly for those new businesses that are just joining HARPS, and we've actually had quite a few coming on lately, which is great. We do have a comprehensive document library where you can find all of the collateral that relates to HARPS. Collateral meaning the standard, the guidance, all of the documents, and we'll go through that. So if you log on to harpsonline.com.au, you'll be faced with a screen that looks much like this. And where to find all of the information that can help you out is under the Growers and Suppliers tab. So if you click on the document library there, you'll be taken to a section on the standard that provides not only version 2, but also version 1 documents that we've got available today. So if we're focusing just on the version 2 documents, what you'll find is the HARPS standard version 2. And this is the condensed version of the document to the right, which is the guidance document as well. So the version 2 standard only contains the elements. It doesn't actually contain any of the guidance. And some businesses prefer to use that, and there's no problem with that. And the version 2 guidance document includes all of the elements along with some guidance to actually help support your implementation of that particular element. It's really important to note, and what we've really been impressing upon the auditors as well through training, is that the guidance isn't auditable. The guidance is there exactly as that, to just provide you guidance for best practice, some ideas and ways of working, as well as why that particular element is actually important, why we're trying to cover it in this standard. To the right, again, you'll see the HARPS standard version 2 scheme rules. And this document is really important as it outlines all of the rules around our standards. So what an auditor actually needs to do to become qualified to conduct a HARPS audit, which is quite comprehensive. What the timeframes are for non-conformance closeouts and what you need to adhere to. And also importantly, if you would like to appeal a decision that's made through the audit process, what that process is. So initially, if you have an issue with non-conformance raised, for example, you can go to your certification body and discuss it with them. If you don't feel that your complaint's been justified, then you can raise that or escalate it to HARPS, and we'll perform an independent assessment of that appeal. So there's lots of rules, obviously, in the scheme rules as it's defined. And there are other things in there, such as extensions and exemptions, all the rules around there. So all of that information you can find on our website, as in different sections of our website library, but also within that scheme rules document as well. To the right there, you can see HARPS standard version 2 summary of changes. That essentially goes through all of the elements as they existed in version 1 and how we've made changes for version 2. And we've received some feedback from suppliers that have been on the version 1 standard for quite some time and were a little apprehensive about version 2, and then called me and said, Belinda, there's actually not that much change. And I can agree categorically. There are changes, and a lot of what we have made to that change is wording and efficiency and removal of duplication and complexity, so that we're actually trying to provide a more clear standard with a lot more guidance to actually support suppliers and growers through the process of transitioning. On the right again, you'll see a document which is an internal audit checklist. So this is a version 2 HARPS internal audit checklist, and it is not a mandatory part of our standards, so you don't have to complete it. I do highly recommend it, particularly for businesses that are new to HARPS, to use this particular document. And it's really a great idea to actually get someone independent of perhaps your role, if you're responsible for the implementation of HARPS, to actually just take a view of how you're going. It's a great one to do before the audit to really help with your preparation, as if that person wasn't, an internal auditor looking at how you're performing in the audit so far. Last time we spoke on the webinar, we mentioned that we were working collaboratively with the Freshcare team to produce a set of documents to help growers and suppliers in particular that are working on the Freshcare standards. I'm really pleased to say that these documents are now available. So for businesses that are actually on the Freshcare Standards FSQ 4.2 or the supply chain standard, you can now access these documents via the Freshcare website. So we don't actually have these documents on the HARPS website. You do need to be a participating member of Freshcare, not HARPS, to actually access them. But what you'll see, and there's some instructions on the bottom there that I'll take you through, is once you get online there, you'll have access to these documents. One is a very high level document. So it talks to the actual elements of the Freshcare standard, and right beside it, it will show the version 2 requirements and where they best fit in your Freshcare manual. And the second document is much like the internal audit document that I just showed you in our document library. It will be a detailed explanation of the requirement for Freshcare, and then on the right-hand side of that, the requirements for HARPS. So you can actually conduct a full internal audit of your Freshcare program and HARPS version 2 within the one document. To access these documents, just log on to Freshcare Online and enter your unique username and password. And if you've forgotten that information, you can just contact the Freshcare office and they can help you out to reset your username and password. Once you're in, click the Select tab, and that will be on the top left-hand side of your screen. Click Resources, and then there'll be a drop-down menu where you can actually access your FSQ 4.2 or supply chain combined resources from there. I highly encourage businesses to look at these documents. There was a lot of feedback that Tristan and I got from our supplier roadshows about why are we not working closer with Freshcare to produce documents that really create efficiencies for you. And I'm really happy to say that we've delivered on that particular point. So please use them. If you see even greater efficiencies that can be made to these documents, please let us know, because we're happy to take your feedback on and look at making these documents even better than they are now. But it should really be a time-saving exercise for you. I'd just like to take the opportunity now to introduce Leah Armstrong, who works at Metcash. Metcash weren't able to join us during the last webinar, so I'm really pleased to have someone from the Metcash team joining us today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Leah.
Thank you, Belinda. Hello, everyone. I'm Leah Armstrong, and I'm a product technologist for Metcash in the fresh and seasonal space. You may already know that we have a very different business model to the other retailers. Through our wholesale distribution network, Metcash supplies independently owned stores across Australia. And these retailers are not required to purchase through us, but often recognise that we not only provide cost savings and convenience, but quality control and robust product standards too. Metcash has been a part of HARPS since its early conception. However, I'm relatively new to the group, and I think it's great that I can provide the HARPS retailers with some new and fresh perspective. Together, we recognise that the scheme is providing substantial benefits to growers, wholesalers, and retailers by harmonising the food safety, trade, and legal requirements across all HARPS participating retailers. With HARPS, we've also observed a sustainable advantage in the market, as our produce suppliers have streamlined their compliance requirements and Metcash's independent retailers have provided consumer confidence to the brand that we are committed to food safety and quality. So if you have any questions, please take a look at some of the resources online and feel free to reach out to the helpline offered. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. Next, we're going to go through the FAQs that are coming through the helpline and our inquiries form. So just remember that anything that you have a question about, you can contact our helpline. It doesn't matter, you know, how silly a question. We're absolutely fine. That's what the helpline is there for, to try and help aid your understanding so that you're getting a really clear perspective on what expectations are. And, you know, very often I'll receive feedback from my calls at the end of the call that will say, I'm actually really glad I called because I had that the wrong way around, or my perception of what was expected or what someone told me is actually not accurate. So I'm glad I called. And I think that's really important because you might be getting guidance from people who've been through HARPS audits before, who may have a different view on things. So if you have a question, I encourage you to call. If I don't know the answer straight away or I need to seek some guidance, I'll make sure that I get back to you. But yeah, never be, you know, shy to call the helpline when you need some advice. So one of the key areas where we receive quite a lot of feedback or questions about is retention samples and shelf life. And we have put a lot of this information in the guidance, but that's okay. Like it's good to sort of really clarify what we're looking for in these particular areas. So one of the questions I get quite often is, why do I need to keep a whole carton of produce? How on earth am I supposed to keep all of these cartons? They take up so much space. They're taking up all my cool room. What am I supposed to do with all this product? Well, let's just set the record straight. The retention sample that we're requiring is just that, a sample. It can be representative of what you think your customers, the end consumers, typically purchase, not necessarily the retailers. So you don't have to keep an OM12 crate of lettuce, as an example, or whatever they are, 8. You can keep the weight or size of what would a consumer would typically buy, and that is also sufficient. In addition, you don't actually need to keep a sample for each retailer if you produce the same product for multiple retailers. That's fine to keep one, but just consider in that process that you're rotating across all of the retailers, so you're getting a good representation of all of those products over time. So just to clarify, auditors are certainly not expecting to walk in and see a wall of product every time, just in relation to retention samples. So that sort of leads into the next question, which is, how often should I be collecting these retention samples? Our standard does say daily or weekly, and that probably causes a few people to scratch their heads. That decision is really based on you and what you feel is the frequency that's right based on a risk assessment. So what do we mean when we're talking about a risk assessment? It really should consider product safety and any quality risks, along with the volume that's actually being supplied. So obviously, if you like before Easter, like Brees was talking about, pushing through a lot more volume of product, you might want to keep more retention samples. But variability of the product is really the key influencer in your decision of how many retention samples you ought to keep. If you're seeing that the product is particularly uniform, so the growing conditions or the environmental conditions have been particularly stable, obviously, you need to keep fewer retention samples. But if there's been a really high degree of variability, including that increase for orders and things like that, it might actually be beneficial to keep a few more retention samples. That decision is up to you. It's just up to you to justify why you're making those decisions. Sticking on the area of retention samples and shelf life, some of the questions are, in my supply chain, who's actually responsible for maintaining that retention sample? So we've got a little information about this in our scheme rules as well. The responsibility typically lies with the business that's applying the end label and the best before date, if that's actually applicable to your product. And we know that that's not always applicable. It's more about the end label on the product. Typically speaking, it's a tier 1. However, that's not always the case, and especially where we have tier 2 suppliers that have the responsibility of delivering directly to the retailer's distribution centre. In another instance, if a product requires ripening, so mangoes or bananas, for example, it doesn't make a lot of sense to keep the retention sample at the farm, because the product's going to go through ripening, and that will obviously create some fundamental changes to the product quality. So in those particular cases, we would expect that the final point, the ripener, or maybe the tier 1's facility, is where the retention sample should be kept. That decision, again, is up to you as a business. And what the auditor might be looking for in that instance is, what is the agreement between your business as a tier 2 and the tier 1 supplier or the ripener? Who's responsible for maintaining those retention samples? Because it needs to be someone within that supply chain. And finally, what's the importance of collecting these retention samples? They just end up going on moldy on my shelf and I throw them away. Well, retention samples have been highly, highly valuable in past situations, and they can assist with such a various range of issues. Things like verifying compliance to label weights and measures, and when product needs to be tested if there has been an exceedance of a maximum residue limit, and in addition, quality-related rejections and things like that as well. So there are multiple reasons where retention samples can aid and assist the process, particularly if you're getting feedback from retailers or your tier 1 suppliers about how the performance of product is going. The next section that I wanted to touch on is the HARPS standard relating to HACCP training, because we have had some changes there and we do get some questions about these particular areas. So the first question is around, what's a HARPS practitioner? I can see that's actually something new in this version of the standard, and can my consultant be that practitioner? So we do have a definition which is in the glossary at the back of both the HARPS standard and the guidance document. The HARPS practitioner must be a representative of the organisation that is an employee and is responsible for managing the implementation of HARPS. They need to really be accountable for HARPS within the business. If that employee is a consultant, you really need to question how much time they're actually spending in your business. Do they effectively contribute to the ongoing compliance of your organisation? The real question about that consultant is, are they considered an employee of your organisation, or do they stop by once a year or perhaps twice a year to go through your internal audit and that's about it? Then they're off again. We would like the knowledge to sit within the business to ensure that everything that's up to date and relevant to HACCP is able to be shared within your own business. The second question is really around fresh care training, which in version 1 was actually acceptable as a refresher for element 5.2 in version 1. As you've probably noticed, the numbering's changed because we've actually taken a section out of the standard, and training now sits within elements 4.1 and 4.2 of the version 2 standard. So as HACCP refresher training is now requested to be conducted by a registered training organisation or a certified trainer that's actually affiliated with an RTO, fresh care training is no longer acceptable under the version 2 standard. However, it is important to note that any training that was completed prior to the version 2 standard is acceptable. So you don't need to start with version 2 and say, oh, that training that I did with fresh care last year for refresher is no longer valid. It is. For the 3 years, you'll need to do your training in HACCP refresher after a 3-year period. I also wanted to touch on some of the FAQs that are coming up in relation to the HARPS scheme rules and talk a little bit about the certification bodies that represent HARPS in terms of completing HARPS audits. So some of the questions I get asked around, who should I choose? What should I do? Which direction should I go in terms of certification bodies? Or I'm not necessarily happy with my CB right now. What choices do I have? So the Appendix 2 certification body matrix is available online. And this basically provides an overview of all of the certification bodies that can conduct audits, whether you're a tier 1 business or a tier 2 business. And if you are a tier 1 that operates as a tier 2, look for the table that says tier 1 suppliers. So for those tier 1 suppliers, we actually define who the business can use by the retailer. So for Aldi, as an example, there is a list of 7 certification bodies that can conduct audits for HARPS. Similarly for Coles. And once you go across to the right-hand side, you know, a lot of those names are the same, the business names are the same, but for some reasons, there are businesses that accept fewer certification bodies. HARPS doesn't make that decision for tier 1 suppliers. The decision is made by the retailer. So please be mindful of that if you're a tier 1 supplier. For the case of tier 2 suppliers, it's a little bit different. Just a note there in relation to Costco suppliers, irrespective of whether you're a tier 1 or a tier 2 business, you do need to refer to the Costco list that sits under that table for tier 1. But for every other retailer, that decision is made by the scheme's approval. So for example, let's have a look at Fresh Care Food Safety and Quality, because that's the standard that is most prolific under HARPS. There are a number of certification bodies that can conduct your audit, including ACO, Ausqual, BSI, Murio, Nutrisciences, Intertech, Cyqual International, and SGS. So if you're a tier 2 supplier, you can refer to that list under tier 2 table there. So if you're doing SQF, they are the businesses that are listed that are approved to conduct the audit in conjunction with HARPS. So you have your SQF audit and HARPS. You can use Ausqual, BSI, Meriu, Intertech, or SGS. So I hope that's clear to everybody. If you have questions, again, please give us a call if you're confused about what I should be referring to, what the rules are specifically around Costco. Help me out with that. All of those questions are really important to make sure that you're making the right decisions around which certification body to use. I also wanted to touch on just a couple of quick things in relation to working with certification bodies. I don't think it's any surprise to businesses out in the industry that there is not an infinite number of auditors available to conduct either the GFSI audits or HARPS. We do have quite a lot working out there, but scheduling your audit as early as possible when it's practical to you and when it's necessary, i.e. not unannounced, is really, really helpful. It provides information to the CB to allow them to schedule way in advance of when your audit takes place. And it can potentially lend to your audit being combined with other audits in the same region, which potentially can lower your travel costs for the audit as well. So early intervention, early scheduling is going to be really, really helpful with your audit. To try to assist with this process, we actually place key performance indicators on our certification bodies to really encourage them to actually schedule early with businesses as well. So don't be surprised if you are contacted 3 months before your regular audit cycle or audit month to try and get that date locked in. And I know it can be really hard as a grower in particular to envisage, am I going to be packing? Am I going to be harvesting? There are ways of working around this and ensuring that we look at records if you're not actually, harvesting on the day, due to, rain or whatever happens. We will be considerate of that. So the auditor will be considerate of that, or give us a phone call so we can make sure that everything goes smoothly on the day and there are no problems. But really important. So just ensure that you are scheduling your audit nice and early, and obviously that might be more beneficial to, helping all of the audits get scheduled, but also might be helpful on your bottom line as well. Another question that we get asked in relation to HARPS scheme rules is about the involvement of external consultants at the HARPS audit. Now, we don't want to be dismissive of the role of external consultants because we know they certainly add value to your businesses, particularly to the businesses that are smaller and require external assistance because they have so many things that they need to do and they don't have quality managers or teams that can actually support the process. But for the purpose of the audit, the auditor is really making an assessment of how many gaps exist between the HARPS standard and how your business is functioning. So having someone external to your business that's not actually involved in the day-to-day activities and how your business operates is really not beneficial to your business in the long run. What the auditor will be looking for is how you as a business can actually respond to the questions and your understanding of what is required of HARPS. So certainly the external auditor can be there from an observational perspective, and you know, I encourage that to an extent as well, so that they can take on the feedback, look at any non-conformances, treat that as continuous improvement. It's not a big stick approach if you get a non-conformance. It's an identification of a gap that needs to be reviewed. So let's look at root cause. How did that non-conformance occur in the first place? And let's look at the corrective action, which is really the sustainable management of implementing actions that will work for your business and meet the standards and requirements. So if you ever have any concerns or issues around having your consultant there, please let us know in advance of your audit so that we can talk through that. You might be a little bit nervous if it's your first time going through an audit process, and certainly we can have some conversations to help guide you through that process. The next area I wanted to touch on is an area that was actually brought up to us by a couple of auditors and relates to communication between Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. So there are a couple of areas within the HARPS standard that actually rely on communication between Tier 1 and Tier 2. And this includes the distribution of specifications. So if your Tier 1 supplier is accessing perhaps retailer portals to get an identification of what those specifications are, it really is important that they're sharing with you those specifications or delivering a spec that meets the requirement of the retailers. This is also true for packaging and labeling as well. So some of the feedback that we've received from auditors is that there is such limited communication between Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers, less so out in industry and in particular pockets, but more so around the role of the market agent and what's happening in terms of sending that communication through. Tier 2 suppliers, I really encourage you to chat to your agents or Tier 1s to try and get this information. So let those discussions broaden around what the expectations are of you and your business. And they could be really, really helpful in setting some clarity around what those goals are. It's really helpful also around shelf life validation and retention sampling that we just touched on earlier, as well as the mock recall process. It's an ideal opportunity to be working with your Tier 1 and getting a full comprehensive understanding of what to do in a situation like a recall or withdrawal and how to see through that process. And finally, in relation to product testing, so that could be MRL testing or micro testing, understanding whose role it is to collect that sample and how often, as an example. So I'm sure it's no surprise to you that communication is really, really important, but it can help support your long-term goals and actually helps to develop trust between your relationships so that both parties are actually more comfortable sharing information and working together. And if you want some ideas and tips on how other suppliers have done it and you'd like to talk to me about that and what are some success factors in, you know, I never hear from my agent or I never hear from my wholesaler, how do I actually spark that communication? Again, we can give you some examples of how to communicate with them and the best way to have those conversations to meet your goals in meeting the standard. I just wanted to take a moment to touch on training again. So we've gone through all of the collateral that we've got within the document library that speaks to the, you know, the hard documents that you can look at, all the online documents that you can use to support your transition. In addition to that, we have actually created some training videos. So if you prefer to view rather than read, that's no problem. I suggest you click on the training section, the training tab there, and you can access the transition training videos that we've pulled together for the transition to version 2. So these videos are really being designed to give you a brief chat or an overview of each of the sections of the version 2 standard, and we talk about structural changes, any new elements, and as well as the tools and templates that are available for you to access. And you can download those free of charge, or you can share these training videos with other people within your business to say, hey, here's the latest information about HARPS. This is the expectation that we are required to meet. In addition, we actually conducted a tender last year that went out to industry to create some relationships with training bodies to deliver HARPS material. So it's HARPS training material delivered by 2 particular providers, and you can get information on who those providers are under the training tab. So we invited these guys to speak last time, but Fresh Business Training is Belinda Wilson Charters on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you'll see Quality Associates, so Andreas Kleber there. You can work with either of these training partners. I think if you click on those Learn More tabs, you'll get a suite of information. And if you've got more questions about online versus offline or face-to-face, costings, how I might be able to combine other training with the HARPS training, best to speak with those guys directly, and they'll be able to give you all of the information to support you. That training isn't mandatory, by the way. In the version 2 standard, the mandatory training requirement is around HACCP training and not around HARPS training, but we do recommend it, particularly for businesses that are brand new to HARPS. You'll get a really good comprehensive understanding of what the standard requires. Finally, I just wanted to talk about the HARPS post-audit survey. So if you'd like to be a part of this, I really encourage you to do so. We've been reflecting on how audits work and some of the feedback that we get around the audit process, and we'd really like to try to work on ways to make that process better. So we're going to industry with a short survey, asking a series of questions around the service that you're provided with prior to the audit, during the audit, and post the audit in terms of receiving your certificate or receiving your audit report. You can complete that survey either online or via a phone call, and we'll be really, really happy to take on board your feedback, regardless of what that is, because all of these examples, good, bad, or indifferent, can help to make our standard and the process of audit better. We're going into a first phase of this audit survey, and we hope to have some answers and some information by June this year once this first phase is complete. That might take us into another round of surveys. But if you would like to participate, and we really encourage you to do so, please contact us via our inquiry form that you'll find on the HARPS website on the right-hand tab on the far side of your screen. Okay, I might pause there because I've been talking for quite some time. Tristan, do we have any questions from the audience that we'd like to go through?
None have come through to me, so we haven't got any at the moment. But if people do have questions, please feel free to email them through afterwards, and we'll certainly come back to you with answers. And potentially there's up onto the on the website FAQ section on the website if need be.
Great, thanks, Tristan. Finally, here's the way to get in contact with us. I think we most people would know how to reach us now, but if you do want to reach us directly or via the phone, I'm the person that answers the phone all the time, so you'll always get me. Call that 1300 number or harps@harpsonline.com.au or our email addresses, and you'll be able to reach us directly with your questions. People on the panel, did you have any comments or anything you'd like to go through before we wrap the session up?
You've covered everything very well, Belinda.
Thanks, Dale.
My only question would be, you've got the relationship with Fresh Care. Is that likely to extend to the other GFSI entities?
Thanks, Dan. Great question, actually. We haven't basically gone into that discussion just yet. We haven't had any, I guess, real desire from businesses that are on Global Gap or SQF Certainly not PRC, because it is such a small portion of the growers that are actually, or suppliers, I should say, that are on GFSI standards. But certainly if that demand is there, we will produce, work with those standards and look to producing something similar.
Right.
And I think, Dion, at the moment, the bulk of the GFSI scheme is with Fresh Care, which is why we've prioritised Fresh Care in the first instance. But yeah, can certainly pick up those other standards if there's the need.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Brice or Leah, did you have any comments or anything to add before we round the session up?
I'll just thanks for a great presentation, Belinda and Tristan and everyone else, and very happy to be there. And have a great Easter.
Yeah, everyone have a great Easter. Finally, Tristan, did you want to just touch on some opportunities before we close up the meeting?
Yeah, sure. Look, last couple of minutes. Where we're looking, where do we want to go? I guess there's lots of opportunities out there. Where we do see a greater need is to engage more with those tier 2s and potentially tier 3s as well. And the best vehicle for doing that is through the peak industry bodies, because they've got that reach upstream that's already established. It's always been a struggle for HARPS, because the retailers have relationships with tier 1 suppliers, and then tier 1s essentially manage that relationship with their tier 2s. So the retailers don't have any direct access to tier 2s. As we built the HARPS database, we are more able to email the tier 2s and so on, but that's it'd be better to sort of have more established routes to access those people. And I think where we see there's a breakdown in communication is sometimes that the information stops with the commercial leads. We would certainly love to see more technical representation on the senior leadership teams within each of the businesses, all our suppliers. I think that would be great to see a technical conversation that goes further up into the organisation, and that helps build that positive food safety culture. And I think in terms of the future state, where do we want to go? It's about probably improving the audit experience for growers and suppliers. So that means, can we use things like digitisation, Fresh Care in that area, which we're sort of working with them on as well, potentially. Also, how can we ensure that minimize the amount of time that it takes, which obviously helps reduce the cost by looking at remote audits. And I think those are the two big things that, with the the improvement in technology, that there should be improvements we can make, which gets a better outcome. We're still meeting those food safety needs and improving the food safety outcomes, but we're also actually improving the experience for growers, and we're minimizing time and cost. And I guess just finally, we do have a very close relationship with Hort Innovation, obviously with HARPS. And given their ability to fund projects, it would be great to be looking at projects that actually address root cause issues, things specific to Australia. A lot of the food safety knowledge does, come in from overseas, and that's good, because we want to learn from things that have happened elsewhere to prevent them from happening in Australia. But there's also a need to make sure they're relevant to Australian growing conditions. So leveraging the ability of Hort Innovation projects that could meet that objective. And ultimately, as we said at the beginning, the HARPS model of having all the retailers sitting around one table is pretty unique. There's nowhere else in the world that actually does that. So how can we use that model to other industry-wide challenges, whatever they may be, in the ethical space, the environmental space, the auditing, capacity and capability, all those sorts of things, I think are topics that we can possibly put into the HARPS business model, and ensure that industry has a voice and have representation with the retailers. So it's a mature and progressive conversation that happens that really moves our industry forwards. And I think we're almost done in time, but that would be, thank you once again for your attendance today. If you have questions, please do come through to us. Go through your peak industry bodies, go through to Hort Innovation, come through to 1300 number, talk to your retailers. Would love to hear from anyone who's got anything they'd like to raise. Thanks, Belle.
Thanks, Tristan. We'll stop the webinar there. Thanks very much for your attention, and see you next time.